What if everything we believe about right and wrong, good and evil and justice, was completely misguided? This was the groundbreaking idea introduced by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was one of the first thinkers to critically challenge the moral values that prioritize sympathy, kindness, and altruism, arguing that they are not only arbitrary, but also harmful. This bold stance earned him the title of the philosopher for rebellious youth. But few take the time to grasp just how revolutionary his views truly were, shaking the foundations of traditional philosophy. In this video, we'll explore why Nietzsche rejected Christian morality, how striving to be a good person can lead to misery, and why so-called moral people are often hypocrites. But before diving into these controversial claims, let's first understand how Nietzsche believed our current moral system came into existence. The history of morality, according to Nietzsche. In the play Amadeus, the composer Salieri develops an obsession and envy toward Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. While Salieri had to work incredibly hard to become a successful composer, Mozart writes far superior music effortlessly. Enraged and resentful, Salieri sets out to ruin Mozart's career, tarnish his reputation, and eventually poison him to death. Since the play's debut, Salieri has become an almost universal symbol of the destructive power of resentment. Salieri finds no joy in his revenge. His resentment ultimately destroys him just as much as it destroys Mozart. His life's mission was not self-improvement, but dragging Mozart down to his level. According to Nietzsche, our entire moral system was built by resentful people like Salieri. He paints a picture of history that is somewhat fictional, but aims to trace the general course of the creation of a moral system. Initially, when humans began forming tribes and societies, the most powerful people rose to the top, and they were the ones who decided what was good. They had no trouble defining it, immediately considering all the qualities they possessed as good: strength, competence, and the ability to dominate. Nietzsche is quick to emphasize that this was not crude individualistic hedonism. With strength and competence comes the ability to be reliable and useful, and with the ability to dominate comes the ability to protect and provide for oneself and others. At this point, it's not altruism or weakness that's desirable, but rather personal excellence. This is what Nietzsche refers to as master morality, or noble morality. For Nietzsche, the defining characteristic of this morality is that it is constructive. It begins by defining what is good practically from nothing. It also has a concept of bad, but only in the sense of lacking the qualities considered good, almost as an afterthought. This is why Nietzsche thought this type of morality affirmed life. It gave people something to strive for. It was active, energetic, and strengthened the will of individuals. On a larger scale, it led to successful societies that could conquer rivals, subjugate them, and ensure the prosperity of their civilization. But with conquest and the will to dominate others, inevitably comes some kind of caste system. There are the conquerors and the conquered, the powerful and the powerless, or, as Nietzsche puts it, the master and the slave. And just as there is a master morality, over time a slave morality will arise. The subjugated class will not tolerate their treatment forever. They will come to resent their dominators. As a result, everything the master morality considers good will be deemed evil by slave morality. Where the aristocrat values strength, the servant will value weakness. Where the master values the will to dominate, the slave will value submission and obedience. And where the noble values the capacity for great deeds, whether for good or evil, the servant will value harmlessness. Nietzsche thought this was entirely understandable. After all, if you've been dominated, you know how unpleasant it feels and will find it difficult to value domination. But Nietzsche points out a fundamental difference between slave morality and master morality. While the powerful defined the good practically from nothing, and only later defined the bad in opposition, the starting point of the morality of the powerless is to demonize everything the powerful have. There is no aspiration here beyond weakness and incompetence, at least according to Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, this slave morality reached its pinnacle in Christianity. All Christian values, helping others, loving your enemies, praying for your tormentors, the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, are meant to demonize strength and domination in favor of passivity and submission. It is the quintessential example of slave morality, and Nietzsche argues that it has conquered all of Europe and beyond. A key concept to introduce here is the will to power. Nietzsche believed that every human being has within them a will to dominate others and their environment, to impose their will on the universe, to change things and reshape the world according to their desires. It is this will that drives the powerful to dominate the powerless, and it is the same instinct that drives the powerless to seek revenge by slowly transforming society's values. In summary, Nietzsche believed that our current moral system was the result of a resentful rebellion, where the subjugated sought revenge on their dominators by gradually transforming society's values. It may seem like a strange image today, and you might ask, so what? Shouldn't we promote altruism, selflessness, and helping others? Nietzsche would say that this is a valid question, but he argues that there are huge problems with making these our universal moral concepts. And that's what we'll move on to next. If you'd like to learn more about philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my mailing list. The link is in the description. The consequences of mediocrity. In Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, the story is told of a man whose life is wrecked by passivity and mediocrity. He makes endless promises to himself, from great feats he will accomplish to evil acts he will undertake. What he really desires is insignificant. What matters is what happens next, which is nothing. He takes no action and makes no effort to change the world in any way. It wouldn't matter if the underground man were the most evil creature in history or the kindest soul to walk the earth. He is ineffective, so none of it matters at all. He has no will, no strength, and no ability to make things happen. This is what Nietzsche fears will happen to us if we fully embrace slave morality. According to Nietzsche, two factors drive slave morality: resentment and a fear of power. We'll talk about resentment later, but for now let's focus on this intense fear of the powerful, and even of power itself. Nietzsche points out something both deep and obvious. To achieve anything, one needs to be powerful. Anyone who has accomplished something significant must have had either extreme strength or extreme competence, or both, unless they changed the course of the world completely by accident. This applies equally to the generous philanthropist who uses their great resources to help others, and the imperial general who uses the same resources to subjugate millions. For Nietzsche, the point is that you can't have one without the other. You can't create extraordinary men without also creating extraordinary monsters. Sometimes they even come in the same package. Famously, Nietzsche described Napoleon as a grand mixture of monster and superior being. The fear of power will only suppress those capable of standing out and becoming extraordinary. If Napoleon had adopted the belief that it is better to be powerless and meek than powerful and strong, he would never have changed the face of Europe forever. According to Nietzsche, the moment we fear power, we are working against ourselves, against our potential, and against the overall success of the species. At the beginning of On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche says he will test aspects of our morality to see if they promote greater utility and prosperity for both the individual and the society they belong to. For Nietzsche, the fear of power fails on both fronts. In the case of the individual, it means that only those without vision will end up happy or satisfied. In the case of society, it means it will never produce people capable of making great strides forward for the benefit of their communities. If Napoleon had been a little more skilled, he might have conquered all of Europe, and we might be speaking French today. Nietzsche asks whether Napoleon would have succeeded if France had been instilled with centuries of Christian values. Nietzsche encourages us to free ourselves from our fear of power. If we don't, we doom both ourselves and our societies to insignificance. It's only a matter of time. But perhaps this sounds a bit speculative to you. I must say that in some points it does seem somewhat exaggerated. Externally, Christian societies have been some of the most successful and powerful in history, although Nietzsche would argue that this is only because they hadn't yet fully embraced slave morality. However, Nietzsche presents another critical argument. Slave morality will make us miserable. 3. Resentment, self-destruction, and morality. I mentioned earlier the idea that our value system comes from the dispossessed who resent the powerful. But for Nietzsche, building something on such a feeling is a complete disaster. This is because it alienates us from what we want to become and makes us miserable as a result. This might seem a bit abstract, so let's bring it down to earth with a story often used to illustrate this point: Aesop's fable of the sour grapes. Aesop tells the story of a fox who leaps to reach some grapes hanging from a nearby tree. After failing to catch them several times, the fox gives up and comments that the grapes were probably sour anyway. This soothes the fox in the moment, but fundamentally condemns him to never getting the grapes. If another fox came along and managed to get the grapes, our hero would become resentful. On one hand, he still desires the grapes, but on the other, he has demonized them as something not worth having. This contradiction will eat him up inside as long as he continues to deny his desire for the grapes. Now, replace the grapes with something much more significant, like power, achievement, or influence. These are things Nietzsche believes all people want to some extent, but they are also the very things condemned by slave morality. The problem is that simply labeling them as bad isn't enough to stop people from desiring them. For Nietzsche, it is basically impossible to stop desiring them. It's a basic human instinct oriented toward preserving and improving our lives, the will to power. Far from stopping this drive, the person living under slave morality is told that a fundamental, immutable part of themselves is bad, and that they are blameworthy for having it. This may prevent them from following their will to power, but it will also torment them inside. It will create generations of miserable, self-hating people who have had their aspirations to greatness crushed. It condemns us both to despair and mediocrity. And when we live our mediocre lives, we will look at those whose will to power has not been suppressed, those who are out in the world achieving great things or simply trying to achieve great things, and we will become deeply resentful. We will look at those more powerful or successful than us and tell ourselves that they must be evil, or that what they have isn't worth our time. We will tell those striving to fulfill their potential as human beings that they are wasting their lives and will never amount to anything. Who knows, maybe in both cases we are right, but whether we are right or not, we will keep saying it because the alternative is deeply painful, that we once had the potential to strive for greater things in life, but that time has passed, and we are condemned to live the same monotonous days until we die an unsatisfied death. For Nietzsche, a substantial critique of our current moral system is that it doesn't do what it claims to do. Being good should be useful and life-affirming, but according to Nietzsche's analysis, being meek, gentle, passive, and selfless does none of those things. All it does is condemn us to a life of constant frustration by denying our will to power. In his view, it's a deeply dishonest way of living, and that's exactly what we will discuss next. 4. The moral man. We all know someone who has become completely unbearable through their moral system, the kind of person who gives you a lecture at dinner and demands that everyone around them follow impossible moral standards that they haven't even accepted themselves. They show no interest in developing their own novel ideas, but are busy condemning those around them for various sins, especially those who live more joyful lives than they do. This is Nietzsche's idea of the moral man, whom he invokes at various points, both in Beyond Good and Evil and on the genealogy of morality. From one perspective, they are doing something perfectly unobjectionable. They are simply upholding the values of their moral system. But Nietzsche doesn't buy this story in the slightest. He accuses the moral man of a fundamental dishonesty about their motivations. Righteous anger is a familiar concept. It's essentially when someone gets angry and tries to change another person's behavior, but from a moral standpoint. This kind of anger has motivated everything from the expansion of human rights to the slaughter of different religious denominations. Looking at it as a historical phenomenon, Nietzsche points out that it is essentially a force for domination. It's simply a group of people trying to impose their morality on others. In other words, it is the expression of the will to power of the angry. And it's important to note that Nietzsche sees nothing inherently wrong with this. He thinks it's natural to want to assert your will over others. He wouldn't judge any of these people for wanting to change the world, improve themselves, and help people like them. He simply points out that, far from being a crusade for truth or metaphysical justice, it's all just the will to power with a good PR campaign. But the problem with this dishonesty is that it fundamentally limits the will to power. It means we can only assert our will when we devise some theoretical justification for it. And if we're stuck in slave morality, these restrictions will be very tight. Once again, Nietzsche points out the suffocating effect of morality on those he considers exceptional. The very thing that made Napoleon great in Nietzsche's eyes was his assertion of the will to power. despite not having a moral justification for wanting to conquer all of Europe. It was his ability to act beyond good and evil that set him apart from the rest. Had he instead spent his time agonizing over whether he was acting morally, he never would have left his mark on history. And this is part of what makes reading Nietzsche on morality so challenging. It's hard to overstate just how radical this departure from earlier philosophical analyses of good is. While Aristotle, John Stuart Mill, and Kant asked what good is in itself, Nietzsche treats morality as a set of concepts that humans use and simply describes it, highlighting the elements where it can work against us rather than for us. Whereas philosophy has been concerned with asking what is good, Nietzsche asks, what is good for? But there's a question we all must ask ourselves now. What do we do with Nietzsche's analysis? 5. What comes next? Nietzsche's analysis of morality is one of the most controversial theses in philosophy. It is anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian, and opposes almost everything we intuitively consider good. And this is intentional. But what can we do with this information? Should we abandon our old values and forge new ones that prioritize strength, will, and domination? Well, that's what some people take from it. But if you don't want to go that far, and many don't, there is still a brilliant insight to be found in Nietzsche's thoughts. First, he shows how strength and power need not be bad things. The ability to be a great benefactor to humanity goes hand in hand with the ability to do great harm. A morality that glorifies weakness and meekness to the exclusion of self-improvement and competition is doing a disservice to its followers by actively making their lives worse. Second, he suggests that perhaps we should be a bit more skeptical of those who build their identity around being moral. Nietzsche's observation that professions of goodness can conceal a hidden will to power is a wonderful piece of cynical wisdom. Being wary of the person who uses morality as a weapon is quite good advice for our interpersonal lives. Finally, and most importantly, he shows that we should not take our fundamental concepts for granted as if they were beyond criticism, good and evil, truth and falsehood, appearance and reality. These are not sacred relics that cannot be questioned. We can interrogate them and see if they are doing the work we want them to do. We don't have to completely abandon them, but we might want to modify them slightly to better ourselves and our societies. More than any other Western philosopher before him, Nietzsche reminds us of our freedom to choose our values. The subtitle of Nietzsche's The Twilight of the Idols is How to Philosophize with a Hammer, and this beautifully sums up Nietzsche's approach. Nietzsche is breaking down the old philosophical assumptions that good and evil exist, or that goodness is inherently good, and making way for a new type of philosopher, one who sweeps away the broken fragments of these old systems and creates new ones that foster a powerful, active, loving, and above all, life-affirming engagement with the world. I encourage you to read Nietzsche for yourself to form your own ideas here, as I've had to omit many details. The two key texts to pick up on this aspect of his philosophy are Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morality. And if you want a bit more of Nietzsche's constructive philosophy, click here to learn about his radical doctrine of amor fati, the love of your fate, whatever may happen, and stay tuned for more on his thought to improve your life.